Welcome to the Medicinology podcast. I'm Imogen, an A-level student here to bring you the best people with knowledge and insight on how to get into med school, how to become a doctor, and to help you decide whether a career in medicine is for you. I'm here today with a very special guest, Akshay, who is currently doing his A-levels, but looking to study medicine next year, so has all the insight on how to apply from this year. So keep listening if you're an A-level student like us. Welcome to the podcast, Akshay. It's great to have you on here.
Hello, nice to meet you, and thank you to have me.
That's totally fine. Honestly, it's great to have you on here. And so for listeners who don't know, Akshay is actually the brother of Ayush, who was on the podcast a few weeks ago. And so let's get started with a classic interview question. Why did you want to study medicine? But also, has having a brother in medicine swayed your thoughts about it?
So I think that similar to anyone in medicine, there's always that intrinsic factor to wanting to help people. But I think that for me personally, I've had some family related medical issues as well. And I think the doctors that worked on my family members were really the true values that being a doctor means. And I think that I owe it to them and to society to bring that help to other people as well, just so that everyone gets that high standard of care that my family received at one point.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. And it's definitely one of my reasons for going into medicine as well, having families having various surgeries. And if it wasn't for that, so much wouldn't have happened and they wouldn't have been able to impact other people's lives. But it's nice that you mentioned you kind of owe it to them. Like it's kind of a duty. Like that's quite a nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and to address the second bit of the question, to the second bit of the question, I think that having a brother in a medical school right now also is really unique because I get that inside track, if you will, about how medical school is going and how it feels. And I think that it didn't sway my judgment in any way, but it has given me a more realistic picture of what medicine would be like. And from my brother's experience, he says that it's a lot of work, but it's also not completely work driven. So you have time for other things. So it's not, people shouldn't be put off from medicine because they think they have no time, because in reality, you're still training when you're at med school. And I think that was a good realization for me to have because I wanted to focus only on medicine, but he taught me that it's important to have life outside of medicine as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's brought up all the time on the podcast. Don't make medicine your whole life. And it's good to have a brother to kind of give you those top tips on what to do, what not to do. Yeah, so tell us a little bit about your story so far. It might be a little bit different to other people doing A-levels at the moment. So yeah, just tell us a bit about you.
I'm an international student and I used to study in Japan for the last 15 years or so, or I lived in Japan for the last 15 years or so. And I essentially started school really early at a younger age than most normal people would. I started reception at age 3, and I've been a year and a half up ever since. And that's actually been a bit of a struggle, but also quite rewarding in my opinion. So it allows me to gain some more maturity of like being with older people and trying to like essentially work with them. And I think that gives me a really unique quality. And I think that maturing is something that doctors and medical school interviewers that I went through were looking for. And I think that gave me a really good insight. And another thing is being younger than everyone else has a disadvantage as well in terms of applying to medical school. So medical schools have, specific ones at least, have some cutoffs in terms of age, which kind of hinder my ability to apply for them this year. And me being keen on getting to medicine and getting into that atmosphere, I didn't want to take a gap year. And I think that's not a choice for everyone. But for me, that was the right choice. But that also meant that I would limit the number of medical schools I could apply to.
Yeah, I remember you talking to me about it when we were discussing before the podcast. And it does sound like it has its positives, but it definitely has its negatives. So how have you kind of dealt with that? And obviously applying to unis and then realizing you can't go to them, how have you kind of dealt with that?
So obviously, I was always the person who wanted to go for those higher tier universities like Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, King's College London. And I obviously applied to them like many people. And I was also applying for those higher universities. But I also realized that in terms of medicine, it doesn't matter where you go because you're all going to end up in foundation year. And also each university, even if they're not Oxbridge level, they have very good benefits, such as one of the schools I applied to, which my brother goes to, is Hull York Medical School. At first, I never heard of it until my brother applied. But after he applied, he's kind of given me some knowledge about the societies they have and how their teaching is. And they have quite a high research output, which I think is another thing I'm interested in and is useful for a lot of medical students as well. So you don't necessarily go to the university for the name. You also want to look into the course a lot as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have mentioned that before, how you kind of end up with the same degree at the end. It doesn't really matter where you go. And obviously some unis are going to teach you differently. So that's something to take into consideration, no matter how prestigious it is. So it's good that you've been able to get that kind of pieces of advice, so you realise that. But so obviously you've applied this year and you've had a few interviews and that kind of thing, but what has been the hardest part of your application process so far, do you think?
I'd say actually getting rejection from certain universities is the hardest part, and I can say from personal experience and from all my friends as well, getting rejected is quite emotional toll, because most people have been dreaming to go to certain universities. I was that way with Oxford. However, I think that a thing that's not highlighted enough online and to other people through schools is that being rejected is not the end all be all, because you always have those good options outside of those schools. And the worst comes to worst, you can always apply the other next year. And I also think that I had my hopes set on Oxford, but that kind of blindsided me to realizing that if I get cut off from Oxford, what does that mean for me? And I think it took me some time to realize that medicine is still medicine. I still want to go into it. And it's not just Oxford that offers me the path I want to go to. And other schools have different benefits. So Hull York, for example, I'm going to keep bringing that up because my brother, is that their research output allows me to spend a lot of time on focusing on what I like to do, which is related to neurosurgery. And I've been researching in that field as well. And I think that allows me to have free time in doing that. And that's why I think that I know it's easy to say now that I've been through it, but after your rejection, it's not the end of the world. And you always have another university that, in all honesty, will be just as good for you. So that, I think it's easy to say, but to get through it, it's a bit of a gut punch, but you have to get through it and kind of work your way out of that feeling of despair. And it's okay to be a bit sad at yourself, but at the end, you know that if you're set on medicine and you're set on going through that path, you always have an option.
Yeah, that's such great advice, actually, that even if it's not what you were planning initially, there's always something. And as you said, medicine's still medicine, and it's still going to be there. Even if you came back 20 years later, you could still do it, and there's always options, as you said. So what offers have you got now? What interviews have you got?
So I've had an offer from University of Central Lancashire, and their interview was actually my first interview, which I really enjoyed, actually, which I know that is quite odd to say, but many people say that it's very stressful. But I think that being calm and composed is one of the ways you can actually enjoy yourself in the interview. And if you enjoy it, you're going to be more natural in front of them as well, because they're trained to look for the like the fakeness or how insincere or sincere you are. So if you're relaxed and you say your true thoughts, then they'll like you, you'll like yourself for doing it, and you'll feel much better in the end. And my second interview was with Hull York Medical School. I haven't heard back yet because they released their offers in February, so fingers crossed.
Oh, good luck for that. That's it's quite scary, I can imagine, quite tense. But yeah, well done. And with the interview at Lancashire, was that an MMI?
Yes, so all the universities I've applied to are MMIs, and I'm still waiting back on Nottingham University, which I'm hoping for an interview there as well. And all of them are MMIs. And I think that MMIs, they take practice to get used to them, because they're not really how you'd expect them to be. But eventually, through like online free courses like Med School Insider, the Medic Portal, all have really good resources. And I think I can't stress this enough. I've read a lot of books on ethics as well of medicine, and those actually, not even the concepts, but the flow charts that they make, how to approach a situation, really helped me in the role play scenario, because that was probably the one I was most afraid of, because that's the most hard one, because you can't anticipate what's going to happen. But otherwise, it's mostly just research on the university and why would the university fit you. That's the main issues or main questions that they'll ask you.
That's really interesting, because I've done like a tiny bit of MMI practice, and you're right, it is not what you'd expect. So they ask you a question, and then the answer they're looking for is quite different to the question they've asked. So, for example, what are the main qualities in a doctor? You can't just say communication, teamwork, blah blah. You've got to say, this is it. This is where I've seen this in like work experience or something else, and this is where I've shown it. And it's just like, oh, okay. Well, if I hadn't had any practice, I wouldn't have known that at all. So yeah, definitely look at those resources and do the practice you need to do.
Yeah, and another thing is, it doesn't matter if you have a school teacher that's going to do the interview with you or your parents. Essentially, online has all the resources and all the answers people have given in the past. And actually, they're looking for a set characteristic, but they're not looking for a set answer. So you don't have to have a boilerplate answer that everyone gives. You want to be unique to show that you would be a different person to the other applicants, but you also want to come across as the characteristics they're looking for, which I think everyone knows what a doctor needs, and they're looking for those characteristics, but they don't expect you to be perfect, because that's what being a medical student is, learning through the process to become a competent and good doctor.
That's really good points to make. I like that kind of being unique, but also don't be too out there and wacky, which is, yeah, very, very good point there. And going back to the role plays, because I don't really know much about how that works. So is there like a kind of fake patient, or what do you have to do?
So they're not always patients. So I'm not allowed to say the details surrounding my interview, obviously. However, some of them can be very different outside of medicine. It can be a situation where you have to be empathetic to a person that's not really medically related, but they're looking for the qualities of a doctor that's compassionate, that is able to communicate, and also able to actually empathize with the patient, while also creating a boundary of professionalism as well. So they're looking for those, but they want to see how you can express it in a situation. And again, I'm stressing this, they're not looking for someone that knows what they're doing at this moment, or being able to diagnose a patient or something. They're looking for someone who has those qualities.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because I mean, if you did know it all, they might get a bit suspicious as well. Like, well, why do they know all this stuff? So yeah, that's definitely a good point to make. And empathy, you mentioned there a lot. And would you say that's one of the main qualities that a doctor needs? I'm just going a bit off piece here. Would you say that's like the main one?
I'd say that it is one of the main ones, because I think everyone has been to the doctor for any sort of reason in their life, but it's always slightly nerve-wracking for any family member or just the patient themselves just going to the doctor. I think that is a quality that doctors sort of have to distance themselves from to keep professionalism, but it's also something we have to be empathetic and keep in mind, because patients will always have that fear of meeting a doctor. And I think that is a really important thing, that doctors have to be able to empathize with their patients as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It is true. Whenever you go to the GP or a doctor, you're never going, yeah, I can't wait to see the doctor and tell him about my problems. Like it's not necessarily a fun thing, is it? So yeah, definitely have that patience and empathy. And so going a bit back to more A levels, what would you say is your favorite way to revise?
Knowing my brother and all medical school students, don't hate me for this, but Anki's the best. Anki flashcards help me revise content wise, help me get through them all the time. So I just started using them, and I've seen improvement already, because I just think that being able to type in your answers, make your own questions, kind of helps your own revision, other than just getting notes and writing them down. So I like that method of revision, but I also like listening to my notes into like putting them in speech to text, or just watching YouTube videos. And I think that all those consolidated is the best resource. I wouldn't say there's one way, but for me, it's all three of them put together make myself like the best I can be on my A levels.
That's really interesting, because Anki is definitely very controversial among medical students. Very like Marmite, love or hate it. And it's interesting that you're using it already, because I've never heard an A level student use it before, but I have heard a lot of medical students use it. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting one. So is that just digital flashcards basically?
It's essentially just digital flashcards, and I think that the limitation with physical ones is that you can just flip them over, but you don't actually write them down. But at least when you do it digitally, you type your answers in. So it's not exactly like writing them. You're writing answers down, but at least it's you're getting them out and you're getting them on paper, and you can't just say, oh, I basically got it, because you've written a set answer based on the textbook or the notes that you're using.
That's a really good point, actually. And also, you don't lose them, because paper flashcards you could lose, or like if it rains, they're gone, and that's not good. And definitely that thing about, oh yeah, I was basically right. I was testing my sister on biology the other day, and I said, oh, what's the answer to this? And she said something, and then I repeated the answer on the flashcard. Said, yeah, that's basically what I said. I'm like, well, not quite, but yeah, it's definitely true. You need to make sure you've got those specific answers, especially in A level. The mark schemes are so specific. So anyone doing A levels, watch out for that as well. So with A levels, with the medicine application, obviously you have to do your A levels, you have to do interviews, and you have to apply. But another part of it is the UCAT exam. And so when we were talking, when I was thinking of inviting you on the podcast, you were talking a lot about the UCAT, and you obviously had a lot of tips for that. And without giving too much away, because don't want to give away everything, but what would you say your top 3 tips for the UCAT exam?
So firstly is there's no real set way to approach a question. There's always like different approaches, but the UCAT has different sections, as many people that listen to the podcast know. But I think that each section has their own like merits that they're looking for. And so my first difficult one was verbal reasoning, because it's easy to understand the text once you've had time to read it, but the UCAT is under pressure, because that's also another thing that's important of being a doctor, being able to work under pressure. So you can't necessarily read through it all. And to do that, you have to kind of use keywords and skim read it and do that all quickly. So the easiest way is what I like to do was make mind maps before the exam. When I was doing practice exams, was make mind maps of the questions I saw, and essentially take words in the question and think of words surrounding that, and then looking for those within the text. And that helps me like derive the answer. I think that's a skill that you get over time. And like I said, the UCAT, you can't really just sit down and be good at it unless you're really gifted at that. But it's something that takes some grind, and you need to work on it and take some time to do. And with that said, the abstract reasoning section, again, not everyone's gifted at that. I was not one of those people that was gifted at it. But I use strategies like looking at common patterns that they use a lot. So a common one they use is the number of lines and even odd prime numbers and the number of intersections. They use this a lot every year. I had this, I'm pretty sure most of the cohort this year had them at some point. And once you do enough of these questions, like using Medify, a book, UCAT Ninja, all these resources online, they have so many questions. And once you keep going through them, I think you kind of become like a second sense to you that you know what's going to happen. And obviously there's time pressure as well. So you can obviously guess, because there's no negative marking either. So there's no harm in guessing if you can't get it through.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, because I haven't been through it. And a lot of the medical students I asked, they did it quite a few years ago. So it's quite good to get current information about it. So obviously get used to working under pressure. That's definitely a great tip. And look at the keywords and the verbal reasoning, and then look for kind of patterns in the abstract reasoning. I remember doing some practice questions and I thought, oh, abstract reasoning, I love this in the 11 plus. And then I got to the first question, I looked at the answer and I thought, what? That is not what I would have gone for. It was so confusing. So yeah, definitely you need to do a lot of grinding, a lot of working to kind of understand what they're asking you.
Yeah, so a lot of techniques that my friends and I used was something called SSSPN, which is shape, shade, size, position, number. So you look at all these aspects and you go down the checklist. So I think I messed up the order, but it's basically based on the most frequent types of questions that they ask. And there's 2 types of questions. I think that there's ones that are like just one change, and then there's more complex ones that are like they change multiple different things at the same time. And I think those are the harder ones to spot. But the easy ones are, once you find them, it's basically 6 free marks, because there's sets of 6 or 5, I can't remember exactly. So once you find that pattern, you basically have enough time to finish 5 questions at once. So it's kind of like rapid fire, but it's that time that takes you to find the pattern. That's the issue, basically.
Yeah, that's great. And also, I'm going to ask you a last question. What books or articles or kind of things like that did you read to help you with your application process?
With the application, so I read Do No Harm, because I'm a big geek on neuroscience and neurosurgery. That was actually one of the key points in my personal statement, which I'll talk in a minute. But for the UCAT specifically, I read a lot of ethics books again. I think there's a really common one, which is it just highlights all the ethical cases and dilemmas in the past 50 years or so, and it highlights a lot of these medical issues. And those were really good because they kind of tell you the thought process of the doctor that treated them and what you would do in current day NHS. And I think that flowchart method, it sort of removes that like thinking outside the box. But in terms of your UCAT, you don't want to think outside the box. You want to get those answers right, because at the end of the day, the test is important to getting into medical school, and you want to perform well on it.
Yeah, I can understand how that would happen. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, for the UCAT, I think that again, it's really hard to prepare for, in the sense that many people say you can't prepare for it, but that's a myth. I think there definitely is ways to prepare for it, and I think the easiest one intuitively is the situational judgment, and many people neglect it, but it's actually not as straightforward as you think. So there are the NHS core values, and the on the NHS website you can read what qualities of a doctor, GMC, good medical practice, and that all these resources are used in making the situational judgment. And if you read them and you actually understand what the values of them boil down to, you can essentially apply that throughout situational judgment, and you can essentially get yourself that band 1, which is really good.
Yeah, definitely. That's really a great advice. Thank you so much. And also, sorry, I'm just very talkative. I have a lot of things to ask. Have you heard about the new UCAS update?
Yes, the fact that they're removing the personal statement soon. I have heard it. I've actually been a bit conflicted, considering I spent so much time making my personal statement. I think that I have mixed opinions on it. I think that the personal statement has been a bit unfair to some people in recent years, because a lot of people get help from tutors, teachers, and outside school as well. And I think that kind of disadvantages students that don't have access to those resources, because you can always ask teachers, but obviously at some schools they might not have the resources to help accommodate you for medicine specifically. So I think that in the sense that it's positive. However, without the personal statement, universities don't have a look at the person that they're going to interview or give an offer to before the interview themselves. So I think it kind of loses that touch of who are you before they basically see you. And I think that by that point, it's basically just looking at your grades and purely your UCAT, which I think is a disadvantage in itself.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That basically says exactly what I'm thinking, but in better words. Like, it kind of takes the whole personal bit of a personal statement out of it. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Me being the first year that has it, but I'm sure it'll be fine. It gives you questions, so at least you can structure it in exactly the way they want it. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It's been absolutely great to have you. I've learned so much. I hope everyone listening has as well.
Thank you so much for having me. Love your podcast, and I hope to see you some more good episodes as well.
Thank you. That's all today from the Medisynergy podcast. Make sure to share with any other aspiring medics and listen out for next week's episode 2.